It's good to see everybody here this morning. If you will, turn to Luke chapter 22, and we'll be picking up in verse 24 as we're going through the New Testament, and more specifically the book of Luke. And last week we saw Jesus on the night before he's going to be crucified. He is having this fellowship meal, this Lord's Supper instituted by him, and they're sharing together in this meal in the upper room, a very intimate setting in which they are going to see Jesus for the last evening before his crucifixion. And the story here starts with unity, with fellowship, with mutual love, with care between Christ and his disciples, eating the bread together, drinking the wine together, and just being there together in unity. But as we continue through the chapter, we're going to see two lines begin to develop. A separation begins to occur between Christ and his disciples. Jesus' line his pathway is going to be headed towards the cross through a selfless sacrifice. The line of the disciples is going to be self-exaltation, confidence, and then also in self-preservation. Christ is going to show us the pathway or the mode of life that leads in accordance to the divine purpose of God through the Spirit. And the disciples are going to show us a method of living, an approach that is according to the flesh and according to the natural man. And so where this story begins with unity and fellowship and mutual love, it will end up with Jesus on this side of the spectrum and the disciples, the apostles, on the other side of the spectrum. And what this does for us is it helps us to see the contrast between the two, to understand the difference between walking according to the Spirit, according to the divine purposes of God, and according to our own natural self, in a selfish way of living, of just self-exaltation, self-preservation, self-confidence, that sort of thing. Jesus told his disciples in Luke chapter 9, he says, if anyone wishes to come after me, he must deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. And now the apostles have an opportunity to do this literally, to follow Jesus to the cross, to take up their own cross. There should have been 13 crosses there, with the apostles following him there to death. But we're going to find that the apostles went a different direction. They went a different way. And oftentimes we might do the same. And the way that we know whether we are on the pathway of the cross, whether we've taken up our cross and we have our eyes fixed on Christ, following him to the cross, is this idea of, have we denied self? Are we still living a selfish, self-centered life? Are we living a kingdom-centered, a God-centered life, in submission to Christ with our eyes fixed on Christ and running the race that is set before us, to honor and glorify him, and to set aside our own agendas and our own desires and our own purposes? These two lines are going to be brought before us in stark contrast to one another. And whenever you see black and white, whenever you see these contrasts, it really brings to light the difference of these two different modes of life, these two different approaches to life in general. And so we're going to see that little division that's going to grow larger and larger as we continue on in Luke chapter 22. So we read last week Jesus mentioning that one of them is going to betray him. So, one of the persons who are dipping the bread, has his hand in the dish with me, he's going to be the one that would betray me. And the disciples are looking around saying, who is it going to be? Which one of us is going to betray Jesus? Now we're going to see, as we continue on, there's also a discussion among them about who is going to be the greatest. In verse 24, and there arose also a dispute among them as to which one of them was regarded to be the greatest. And this, I would submit to you, is the beginning of the dividing point. Most of us would probably think that where the disciples went wrong was in the garden. That was the starting point. When the soldiers came, Judas there leading the way, he kisses him on the cheek, and they take Jesus and bind him and take him away. When the disciples all kind of scurried and went their own directions, that's when they felt Jesus. But I would suggest that this is the starting point of it all. They were having fellowship with Christ, focused on Christ, eating with Christ, dipping the bread with Christ, drinking wine with Christ, having this unity with Christ. But somewhere along the way in this meal, they became self-focused. And in two ways. And both of these are on either side of the spectrum. Focused on themselves and their possible failure of Christ. Which one of us is going to betray him? Which one is going to be the one who's going to, forsake Christ? And right then they began to become self-focused on themselves. On the other side, they're thinking, who's going to be exalted? Who's going to be the greatest? Who's going to be the one who's going to rise up above all the rest of the apostles? And in both of these ways, they are becoming self-focused. And the same thing can be true of us as well. When we fail, when we fall into sin, maybe when we miss an opportunity to serve Christ, or we know this is the way, this is the direction that God is leading us to, and we go the opposite direction. Oftentimes we think the failure was when I acted wrong, or when I did the wrong thing. We think in a very outward way that here was God's will, this is what I did, and that's where I went wrong. But we need to back it up a little bit and realize, no, the starting point is becoming self-focused and becoming selfish in our approach to the spiritual life. And that can manifest itself in these two different ways. Either getting so focused on your own failures, so focused on your own feeling of inadequacy, or wondering how it is that you are going to fulfill this will of God, and questioning yourself in that way, to where still you're just focusing on yourself and you're not lifting your eyes up to heaven and saying, through God, I can do all things. If he's leading me to it, he can equip me for it. He can help me to accomplish everything, and depending on him and saying, no matter what the Lord puts before me, he'll bring me through it and he'll help me to accomplish it. But we begin to look at ourselves. Well, I don't know. Can I do this? Am I sufficient to do this? Again, focusing on self. But on the other side, we can also become where we become puffed up and arrogant and prideful, and begin to think too highly of ourselves, and our motivations become off. We become self-ambitious, and our motivation for serving the Lord then becomes all about exalting ourselves and being like the Pharisees and the scribes who were putting on long robes to appear before men as something great. Both of these ways of going just gets us focused on ourselves. Instead of just focusing on the Lord and saying, Lord, I just enjoy fellowship with you. I love feasting with you. I love sharing life with you. I love being in the upper room with you, devoted to you, sharing life with you. Lord, I just put you before me above all other things, and I fix my eyes on you, and I'm looking at you, Christ, eye to eye, metaphorically speaking, of course, but looking at Christ through all things and saying, Lord, I love you above everything else, even my own self. When we stop realizing we are in the upper room with Christ each and every day, and we have an opportunity to fellowship with Christ, that's the dividing point. That's when we begin to go our own way. When you just enjoy Christ, when Christ just becomes your all in all, when you love him above everything else, guess what? You have victory then, because you're not looking to your own failures, nor are you looking to your own accomplishments, but you're looking to the one that you love. And you're spending your days, each and every day, just loving him and devoting yourself to him, opening your spirit to him, saying, Lord, come in. I open the door to you. Come and dine with me. That's the pathway of success. The pathway of failure is just looking to yourself in your own natural strength, thinking you have to do everything on your own, living according to your own powers or what you think your own powers are, or thinking too highly of yourself, wanting to exalt yourself. That is not the pathway to the cross. That's not denying yourself, picking up your cross and following Christ. That's living for self and casting away the cross. This is the beginning point of this division between Christ and his apostles, and it can be the dividing point between us and Christ as well. Jesus is going to correct them on this, and notice how he's going to have them then focus once again on him. Their attention is on themselves. He's going to put the attention back on himself. In verse 25 it says, "And he said to them, the kings of the Gentiles lord it over them, and those who have authority over them are called benefactors. But it is not this way with you, but the one who is the greatest among you must become like the youngest, and the leader like the servant. For who is greater, the one who reclines at the table or the one who serves? It is not the one who reclines at the table, or is it not the one who reclines at the table? But I am among you as the one who serves." Look at me. Look what I'm doing. Follow my example. I'm coming as a servant. I am not the one who came in incarnation and came in the flesh to dwell among men so that men could then serve me and honor me and all those things while I'm in the flesh. While Jesus was in the flesh, while he was in this human body, he was there for service, healing the sick, casting out demons, calming the storm, feeding the thousands with fish and bread, constantly serving the people. He gave his life over to the people, not self-focused, but service-focused. And he's saying, look at my example. Look at the example I am giving you to follow. He says the kings of the Gentiles, and that can be literally translated of the nations. The kings of the nations or the Gentiles lord it over them, and those who have authority over them are called benefactors. According to the world, the way that you lead is being very assertive, very aggressive, being very demanding, to have a commanding presence. That's the way the world views leadership. And, you see this a lot in the military, but you can also see it in the corporate world as well. You've got to be a person who really asserts yourself if you're going to be a successful leader. At least that's the way that it's viewed. But Jesus says it shouldn't be this way with you, apostles. We have a different way of leadership called servant leadership. That is, you give yourself wholly to people, you serve the people, you are focused on them and not on yourself, and they can see that and they recognize that, they'll follow you to death if they really feel like you care about them that much. And this is a more effective way of leading people. Showing care and concern and love for people. You do that, people will commit themselves to you in a very certain way. Jesus is saying this is the way of the kingdom. Not trying to be the greatest, but trying to be the servant. He says, this is not to be the way with you, but the one who is the greatest among you must be like the youngest. That's very significant. Now, it doesn't say it plainly, and this is Joey speaking here, but is Jesus directing this a little bit towards Peter? And why do I say that? Well, for one, Peter seems to be one of the main characters in the chapter. We're going to see him directly address Simon Peter here in a moment. But the other thing is that he says the youngest. And it's believed that Peter was actually the oldest of the apostles. There's a lot of reasons why people believe this. If you go by what would typically happen with a rabbi and the students were typically very, very young, probably teenagers, 18 years old, somewhere around in that area. But Peter comes to Christ as a person who's already married. He's already paying taxes. He seems to be already established as an adult. So it's believed that he was the oldest of the apostles. Of course, no scripture tells us exactly how old each of them were, but that's based on the information we do have, that's the best estimate. The best conclusion is that perhaps Peter was the oldest. So this idea of the greatest of you must become like the youngest, perhaps Jesus was looking right at Peter when he said this. Back then, the youngest was the one in submission. In ancient times, if you were the youngest, you didn't speak unless you were spoken to, you didn't assert yourself. You remained in a status of humility in the presence of people who were older than you. If you remember the story of Job, remember Job was having that discussion with his three friends, Zophar, Eliphaz, and Bildad. He was having this discussion, this in-depth discussion. What's going on with Job? Why is it that he's suffering so much? Elihu, who was the youngest of all the friends of Job, he doesn't say anything until the very end of the book of Job. And even then, he doesn't speak up until they're all silent. And he even says himself, I was the youngest. I said, the olders, The older people, the elders should be the ones speaking. I didn't want to assert myself, but you guys have made me angry. I got to say something. But that's an example of where the youngest always had a position lower than those who were older. And the idea here that Jesus is giving is that you want to be the greatest? Well, make yourself as the youngest. In other words, humble yourself. Treat yourself as the youngest. Don't assert yourself. Don't always have to give your opinion. Don't always try to be aggressive and commanding. But just take the status of the youngest. Be humble. And then you'll have status as the greatest in the kingdom. And he says, and the leader like the servant. Serve others. Be devoted to them as mentioned before. And then he mentions who's greater, the one who reclines at the table or the one who serves. Clearly, the person who's sitting at the table is the greatest. The one who's serving is usually the butler or the maid or the servant that's serving the food. And he says, of course, the one sitting at the table is the greatest, looking at it from a worldly perspective. But Jesus says, what did you see in me? I was the one who served. I came as the one who serves. And certainly he did that in a very literal way. We'll find out in John chapter 13 that in the same context, he washes the disciples' feet. And so they got to see that manifested in a very real way, even here at this Last Supper. And then in verse 28, he says, you are those who have stood by me in my trials. And just as my Father has granted me a kingdom, I grant you, that you may eat and drink at my table in my kingdom, and you will sit on thrones judging the 12 tribes of Israel. So he says that there will be a time in which you will have authority. You will be exalted, but not yet. It's not going to happen just yet. You guys have stood by my trials. And here he's specifically addressing the apostles. And he says, just as the Father had granted me a kingdom, so I'm granting you a kingdom. But how did the Father grant Jesus a kingdom? It was through trials, through suffering, through agonizing death. That kingdom. And he's saying, just as the Father gave me a kingdom, I'm going to give you a kingdom. The pathway to the kingdom, the pathway to authority is through suffering, trials, and afflictions now. So that then you will be exalted in the end. So what he's saying here is that you must deny yourself now, and then eventually you'll get what you desire. Your desires will be fulfilled eventually in the future. But for now, the pathway is sufferings and trials and afflictions. Oftentimes, our wanting to sin, those times when we go against the will of God, when our priorities are off, it's usually because we're wanting what God promises us in the future right now. We have eternal bliss waiting for us on the other side. Just joy beyond measure. No sickness, no dying, just eternal bliss and joy. But how often do we want that now? And sometimes we'll even violate God's will for us so that we can have it now. One day we will receive the kingdom in its full manifestation. But right now, often we want to build up our kingdom now. I want to live a life of comfort and pleasure and self-service and self-focused and do whatever pleases me and makes me happy and makes me look good. Not concerned about everybody else or not concerned about God. I want everything I got coming to me. That's when we start getting off from the will of God. When we start wanting what's in the future now. The disciples wanted that. The apostles wanted exaltation right then, to be the greatest in the kingdom. Jesus says there's a time for that, but now is not that time. Now is the time for service and humility. And by the way, this time of the kingdom very well could be talking about the new heavens and new earth. If you cross-reference Matthew chapter 19, there he talks about in the regeneration, you'll sit on the 12 thrones, judging the 12 tribes. The 12 tribes representing God's people. In the regeneration, when God renews everything, the whole universe, the earth, us, when we're resurrected into glory, the kingdom will be fully manifested, and the apostles are going to be the ones in authority. They're going to be the judges. Not judging in the sense of, well, you're going to heaven, you're going to hell. In John chapter 5, Jesus said, all judgment has been given to me. Here when it's talking about a judge, it's talking like the judge that's described in the book of Judges. that is just one who has a position of leadership, a position of honor, that sort of thing. That's what you're going to have in the kingdom. And you're going to have authority over the people of God in that state. Revelation chapter 21, when it talks about the New Jerusalem, the 12 foundation stones are the apostles. So they'll be very important in the new creation. But again, that's in the future. Right now they were to serve. Now he's going to specifically address Peter. If he was just hinting at Peter before, as suggested, now he's going to directly address Peter. There's something Peter needs to know. In verse 31, Simon, Simon, behold, Satan has demanded permission to sift you like wheat. But I pray for you that your faith may not fail. And you, when once you have turned again, strengthen your brothers. Again, the activity of Satan being seen in this particular situation. We saw Satan had entered Judas, right? And he's going to betray Jesus. And now you have Satan wanting to get at Peter too. I got Judas, now let me go for Peter. And he's wanting to sift him like wheat. What does that mean? Well, sifting basically has 3 steps when it comes to wheat. First, you got to cut down the wheat, right? You got to harvest it. But then you got to thresh the wheat. And so what you do is you put the wheat on a hard surface. Today we put it on concrete, but back then probably on a stone pavement. And then you just take an instrument and you just beat that wheat until you break up the outer shell of the shaft. And you break that up, you loosen it up. And then once you've threshed it, then you get this winnowing fork and you scoop it up and you throw it up into the air, and the wind blows away the shaft. And then what falls down then is the pure grain. That's what Satan was going to do to Peter. Peter had a hard outer shell. He's going to show here in a moment that he had a lot of self-confidence. He was the one who always spoke up. He was very much hardened on the outside. He thought, he was probably one of the ones that really thought he was going to be the greatest among the apostles. Satan's going to come through and he's going to sift Peter. He's going to break him down. He's going to chop him down, put him down to size. And Satan's intention then is to destroy Peter and to completely rob him of his faith. But it's interesting here that Jesus doesn't say, I pray to you that Satan would not sift you. He doesn't say, yeah, Satan wants to sift you, but I'm not going to let him. He doesn't say that. What does he say? I pray for you that your faith may not fail. That's the more important thing, that your faith does not fail. Satan is going to sift Peter. We're going to see that as we continue in the chapter. Peter's going to be broken down to size. When he denies Christ not 1 time, not 2 times, but 3 times, he's going to be beaten. He's going to be threshed. And his outer shell is going to be broken as he looks into the eyes of Christ and realizes what he did and then go away weeping. He's going to be heartbroken. But that's going to be part of that outer shell beginning to crack, beginning to loosen up. When it's all said and done, and by the way, Jesus is giving him a promise that he will make it through this trial. He says, once you have turned again, then strengthen your brothers. Eventually, Peter's going to come out as that pure grain. Broken, released from the chaff, and just becoming a pure servant of Christ. And we'll see that happen as we get into the book of Acts. Peter becomes a very powerful person who testifies of Christ. But here he needs to be broken, and oftentimes we need to be sifted. Oftentimes we don't want to be sifted. And our prayer is, Lord, don't let me go through this trial. Don't let me go through this difficulty. And even don't let me fail. But notice how God even uses failure as a means to help us grow. Sometimes we might think, well, if I'm following the Lord, I should never fail. Why would God ever allow me to fail? Especially if I'm living a life before Him. Well, He lets us make our silly mistakes and go our own way so that He can show us, don't depend on yourself. You're too self-confident. You're trying to do this in a very self-willing way. You think your willpower is strong enough to do it, but you have no willpower. You have to trust in me. You have to humble yourself and rely on me continually. Stay connected to me in fellowship. You cannot turn away from me for 1 second because you will fall flat on your face. He needs us to be sifted so we realize, no, I don't have enough power in myself. I don't have enough strength in myself. I always need to keep my eyes fixed on Christ, depend on Him, the strength that he supplies, and the pathway that he opens up for me. We need to be sifted sometimes, and we should praise God when we are sifted, because we come out as pure grain, humble before God, more dependent on him, and less self-reliant. Verse 33, but he said to him, Lord, with you I'm ready to go both to prison and to death. There's that hard shell that Peter had. And he said, that is, Jesus said, I say to you, Peter, the rooster will not crow today until you have denied 3 times that you know me. You think you're so confident. You're so self-reliant. You're going to deny me 3 times. Not once, not twice. 3 times, and it's going to happen very quickly. The rooster isn't even going to crow before it happens. How often do we feel so self-confident? We think maybe we leave church on Sunday morning. We're like, yeah, we're going to go this week, and we're going to do all these wonderful things for the Lord, and I'm never going to fail the Lord. I'm always going to do what's right. And then Monday comes around, and we find ourselves right back in our patterns again, right back to doing what we've done before. Failing the Lord, going our own way, living a selfish life. At some point, we got to wake up. At some point, we got to say, I don't have enough strength in myself. I need the Lord each and every day, each and every moment. Like the song we sing, I need thee every hour. I cannot for 1 second live the life that you're calling me to do on my own, separated from you. And so that's why Paul encourages us in Romans chapter 8 to walk according to the Spirit, not according to the flesh, depending on God to help us to overcome, to help us get through the trials, to help us overcome temptation, to not lead us into temptation. We're going to see that even in this story as we continue in the chapter about Christ telling them when they were in the garden, pray to God that you will not be led into temptation. God can help us, but we must continually remain dependent on him. Verse 35, and he said to them, when I sent you out without money belt and bag and sandals, did you lack? You did not lack anything, did you? And they said, no, nothing. If you remember that was back in Luke chapter 10 when he sends out the 70. He also did the same with what's called the limited commission with the 12. But they went into all Judea, and at one point they were in Galilee, the other time they were in Judea, but they went through these different villages and they were proclaiming the kingdom. But Jesus had told them, don't take an extra pair of sandals, don't take your suitcase, so to speak, don't take a sword, don't take anything with you, travel lightly. And we may comment that the reason that was true, why Jesus told them that, was they had to travel very quickly. This was a short travel that was always going to last for a few months. So they had to travel quickly. They couldn't be burdened with a bunch of equipment, a bunch of luggage. They were dependent on the people that they were ministering to be served and to have a place to stay. Don't even try to move different places. You need to act quickly. Don't even greet people on the way. You need to travel so quickly. Now, Jesus is saying, I'm about to die. Now prepare for the long haul. This isn't a limited commission I'm giving you. This isn't a short little mission or a project that I'm putting you on. Now you're committed for life. And so, prepare yourself. Now you can get an extra pair of shoes, you can get a money belt, you can even go out and purchase a sword, which was a common thing for people to carry around. You can go ahead and now prepare yourself because you're going in for the long haul. I'm about to be crucified, I'm going to die, I'm going to rise again, I'm going to ascend into heaven, and then it's going to be up to you guys to not just go in a little area in Judea or a little area in Galilee, but to the othermost parts of the world. So he's saying, now you can prepare for the long haul. And in verse 38, they said, Lord, look, there are 2 swords. And he said to them, it is enough. It is enough? The 2 swords are enough? Or it's enough? Let's drop this subject. People have different interpretations of that. But the idea is either way, it's enough. They didn't need a lot of swords because that's not what Jesus was leading them to. Not a physical battle or anything like that. It was a spiritual battle that they were going to engage in. It's interesting, if you go back to the story of Saul and David, in all the kingdom there were just 2 swords. And now with Jesus, the son of David, with his apostles, there's just 2 swords in the kingdom. And it was enough. Because it's not that type of battle. That's not the weapons of our warfare. We're here to tear down strongholds in people's minds and in their hearts so that they can open up their hearts to God and receive grace through Jesus Christ. That's the battle that we're engaged in. That doesn't require swords. And then in verse 39 it says, "And he came out and proceeded as was his custom to the Mount of Olives, and the disciples followed him." Again, this idea of as was his custom. So Judas knows exactly where he is going to go. We mentioned this last week in the last verse of, verse 37 of chapter 21. It says that was his custom. He would teach in the temple during the day, and then at night go to the Mount of Olives. And he's doing that here as well. Even though he knows that Judas is going to betray him, and he knows that he's going to be taken away to trial. He's willingly going to be sacrificed. In verse 40, it says, "When he arrived at the place, he said to them, 'Pray that you may not enter into temptation.'" This is the first of two times he's going to tell them this. He told them this also in verse 46 when he found them sleeping. Again, don't be self-reliant. Pray to God that you will not be led into temptation. You will not enter into temptation. Don't think, well, it doesn't matter what kind of temptation comes my way. I'm going to overcome it. Say, "Lord, I'm humble. I'm meek. I realize my weakness. God, don't lead me into temptation. I need your help to live a holy life, to do what is your pleasure." In verse 41, "And he withdrew from them about a stone's throw, and he knelt down and began to pray." So he's not very far away. They probably could hear him praying out these things. But in verse 42, saying, "Father, if you are willing, remove this cup from me, yet not my will, but yours be done." So already we've seen twice here the pathway of the Spirit, the pathway of the cross. We've been talking a lot about the wrong pathway, but this is the right pathway. Jesus doesn't play the self-preservation card. He knows when he goes to the Mount of Olives, it's going to mean his death. But still he goes. And here, he doesn't say, "Lord, save me, and please just save me. Get me out of this situation." He says, "No, let your will be done." Notice how he's not being selfish in this. He is considering himself in the sense that, of course, he's asking for the help of the Father, but ultimately he says, "I want this cup to pass from me, this cup of suffering, the cross, but that's not my primary goal. My primary goal is that your will be done, Father. Even if it means suffering, even if it means a horrifying death." That's the pathway of the cross. "Whoever wants to come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me." If we truly are following Christ, we're going to have the heart of Christ, and we're going to say, "It's not about me anymore." We're going to deny ourselves and say, "Nevertheless, not my will, but your will be done." That's the pathway of Christ, and that's the path that we are called to live. In verse 43, "Now an angel from heaven appeared to him, strengthening him." Which is important as well. When we commit ourselves to this pathway of the cross, it's not like, "Oh, I'm on my own and I just have to try to trudge through it." Heaven itself is engaged in that. Here the angels are strengthening him. And who knows what type of spiritual things are going on behind the scenes to strengthen us and help us in our trials. But God has many resources, many ways of helping us. Either him doing it directly, his angels helping us, whatever it might be. We have full supply in being able to walk this pathway of the cross. In verse 44, "And being in agony, he was praying fervently, and his sweat became like drops of blood falling down upon the ground." In agony, praying fervently. Is that the story of us? When we're in agony, are we praying fervently? Or do we become self-focused and we become despondent and kind of just draw within ourselves? Or do we pray to the Lord, direct our hearts to heaven, set our minds on the things above, not the things on the earth? Now, that'll have two different results, and one is better than the other. Jesus, in agony, prayed fervently. And so much so that his sweat was he was sweating as of drops of blood. Now, Luke is a physician. He's a doctor. So he's the only one that gives us this information. But it's been studied that this is possible, that if a person is so anxious and so stressed out that the blood vessels in their skin can actually burst. And it would cause this appearance of this blood, sweating like blood. It just shows how anxious, how stressed out Jesus was, but all the while praying fervently to the Father, even though he was in this great agony. And then verse 45, when he rose from prayer, he came to his disciples and found them sleeping from sorrow. In agony, he's praying fervently. In sorrow, they're sleeping. Interesting contrast there. Again, these two lines are getting further and further apart. Jesus is drawing his heart closer to the Father in his agony. They're falling asleep in their sorrow. Do we do the same thing? In sorrow, or any type of affliction or trial or difficulty we have, do we spiritually fall asleep? We get maybe so focused on our sorrow, on what we're going through, the trial, that our spirits become, in a sense, dead or asleep so much that we become insensitive to God in those situations? Or do we do what Christ does here and pray all the more fervently? Let our spirits become even more alive because we need God all the more. Are we asleep because of sorrow? In verse 46, and he said to them, why are you sleeping? Get up and pray that you may not enter into temptation. When we are sorrowful, when we are in trials, that's when we are most susceptible to temptation. I think maybe we can all attest to that. Now, those of us who've been walking with the Lord long enough, you realize, when something's bothering you, when you're anxious, when you're fearful, when maybe you have sorrow because of some difficulty you're going through, oftentimes that's when you fail the most, when you're most susceptible to temptation. That's when you're more likely to lash out at your spouse or be short-tempered with your children or something like that. In those times, that's, again, repeat myself, but that's the time we need to pray all the more. And again, don't rely on ourselves, but pray to the Lord. Lead me not into temptation. I can't handle it. I need you to help me. Verse 47, while he was still speaking, behold, a crowd came, and the one called Judas, one of the 12, was preceding them. And he approached Jesus to kiss him. But Jesus said to him, Judas, are you betraying the Son of Man with a kiss? When those who were around him saw that what was going to happen, they said, Lord, shall we strike with the sword? And one of them struck the slave of the high priest and cut off his right ear. But Jesus answered and said, no, stop, no more of this. And he touched his ear and healed him. So here they see, Jesus is going to be led astray or led out and bound. They say, oh, this is the opportunity. This is the moment that Jesus is going to rise up. He's the Messiah. He's the Son of David, the King. And now we are going to be the ones that fight with him. We're going to get our swords and we're going to attack. And we find from the Gospel of John that this is Peter. Peter takes out his sword and he just swings it at this Malchus and cuts off his right ear. Totally missing the point of what's going on. Again, self-interested. They wanted this kingdom to be established so that they could be exalted. And they're going to do whatever means possible to make it happen. Not willingly submit to what was going on. Not understanding what Jesus had told them, that this was all part of the plan. He'd been telling them this for months. But they missed it, and they think that this is an opportunity for the kingdom, as they believed it, to come into fruition. And Jesus says, no more of this. Stop. And he touched his ear and healed him. That's the kingdom. Not striking with the sword and cutting off the ear, but touching people and bringing healing to people's lives. That's where the victory is. We should be people who touch people's ears, in a sense, metaphorically speaking. We touch their ears with the gospel, the sweet message of Christ. And we come to them with that message. And when they hear that message, and as they have a receptive heart, it brings healing to their lives. And that's what Christ brings, a ministry of healing, not of violence and striking and the sword. We come to people and we touch their ear with the gospel, and it brings healing. In verse 52, then Jesus said to the chief priests and officers of the temple and elders who had come against him, have you come out with swords and clubs as you would against the robber? While I was with you daily in the temple, you did not lay hands on me, but this hour and the power of darkness are yours. Again, getting back to the source. We've seen this time and time again throughout this story. The power of darkness. This was illogical. He says, you know what, I've been teaching in the temple, you wouldn't come up against me, but now I'm in this dark area on the Mount of Olives, and now you want to come up against me like a robber. If I was truly a robber, you could have arrested me openly, and everybody would have understood. But he's bringing out the hypocrisy and how illogical this is. But you'll find that in life, whenever something happens that just doesn't seem right, it doesn't seem logical, there's a good chance that there's spiritual forces behind it that's causing it to take place. Here, Jesus recognizes it's the power of darkness that's really at work behind the scenes. And this power of darkness is utilizing these people to try to get at Christ, just as they did with Judas, or just as Satan did with Judas, and just as Satan was going to try to do with Peter. So this is happening also with this band of people who are coming to arrest Jesus. And I think we'll stop there this morning. I don't want to take up too much of y'all's precious time, especially here on Mother's Day. Next week, Lord willing, we'll pick up in verse 54. And we'll see Jesus actually be arrested, some of the things. And we'll be able to continue to follow these two lines between the natural self and the spiritual man. And the big difference between the two, the gaping hole between those two approaches to life. So this morning, as we reflect on what we've studied so far, we've got to ask ourselves, which line am I in? Which pathway am I taking? What mode of life am I engaged in? Am I living a self-centered, self-preserving, self-exalting, self-confident life? Or am I coming to the Lord broken? Am I coming to the Lord in humility and dependence? And am I continuing this mode of fellowship with the Lord? Just continually loving the Lord, having fellowship with Him, eating a meal with Him, as it were, but just staying connected to Christ, eye to eye, face to face with Christ. As long as we're in the upper room, we have victory. It's when we get away from the Lord, when we follow Him at a distance, as we'll see next week, that's when we begin to fail. What type of line are we going to take in this upcoming week and for the rest of our lives? And if you're here today and you haven't even started the pathway yet, maybe you haven't even come to the Lord and given your life over to Christ, this is an opportunity for you to do that and give your life to Him, to begin that pathway of loving Him and fellowship with Him, having victory over sin and temptation in your life, and living a life that honors God, and that ultimately leads to a future home of happiness and joy and no sickness or dying, but eternal bliss with the Lord. If you want to begin that path today, please come forward as we stand and sing the song that JT has prepared.